One thing I could say about this Nick Cannon and Cam Newton interview, Nick Cannon was just is Nick Cannon. That shit was just 100% wrong. But what I will say about Cam and the question he asked, he said, "You are 40 something years old, no children, no kids. Why?" Nothing wrong with that. If that's the life she chose, cool, whatever. But for me, and I think most people who have been married or have kids or had kids or whatever, whatnot, there's a lack of credibility somebody, even with her experience and her knowledge, has in being married and having kids. Yes, she knows it from an educational standpoint, but education and application are two different things. This is just the reality of the situation. They are. Um, a person can tell you how to cut open and have heart surgery, but actually doing it, people fold under pressure every time, all the time, I should say. They think they want to be a doctor, then the first time they see blood, they out of there. It happens. Some people are great at, doing the textbook knowledge, but when it comes to coming up in court, they can't recite or have the charisma, to, be in a courtroom and litigate a case, etc., and so forth. It's the same thing with having a kid. Yeah, from an educational standpoint, she can tell you this, that, and the third, or what's beneficial, what's not beneficial. But in the same token, the application of having a kid and have to deal with them day in and day out and day in and day out is completely different. Being married is completely different than being in a relationship. And I just wouldn't go to somebody who isn't married, doesn't have kids, about that stuff. They wouldn't be my first option. My first option would be a psychologist who is or has been married and does have kids. It's just me. 17 years of experience, it doesn't make a difference in that scenario. Because again, the application is different than the education. So that's all I gotta say about what Cam was right about. Because it's just completely different. It is. It's like the examples I gave before. It's like going to basic training or being at war and hearing about war, the experience of it. Two completely different things. You can't imagine what people have seen at war, what it's like, versus somebody who's just talking about it or seeing it in a video game. It's different. This is not to say she doesn't know her profession. This is not to say she's good at it, but it's just one of those things where it's like your credibility only goes so far because you never experienced it. So that's all I gotta say about that. Let me preface this by saying it's not to say she couldn't have good advice or good ideas. Nobody's saying that. But like I said, that wouldn't be the first person I go to for advice on kids or marriage. To be perfectly honest, in a scenario like that, I'm going to a couple that's been married 20, 30, 40 years before I would go to her. Just saying. And this is when I say you got to be mindful about the therapist or counselor you decide to go to. You have to know what your goals are and how they align to who you're trying to see and achieve them. Could she talk about trauma and life experience or career paths or career goals? 100%. Like, she's the epitome of probably career goals. But marriage and kids, maybe not so much. Whereas in other instances, there might be a therapist or counselor who can talk to you about marriage and kids and all that other stuff, but maybe career goals, not so much, especially if they've had their own practice for 15, 20 years, because they're pretty much out of the loop on what goes on in a Fortune 500 company or etc. and so forth, or working for someone else because they've had their own practice for so long. So these are things you have to be cognizant and mindful when you're picking out a therapist, a life coach, a relationship coach, and all that other stuff, especially these relationship coaches. Because as far as I know, most of them don't even have the educational background. At least Dr. Bryan says she says she has educational background. Y'all going to these $200 certificate relationship coach, and they ain't got a pot to piss in or marriage to speak of. So Just be mindful of that. That's all I'm saying.